The morning Clarence Bristol showed up on Augusta Underwood's porch wearing a suit that was 2 inches too short in the leg and 1 size too wide in the shoulders. The whole town of Harlan Creek, Texas, stopped what it was doing and stared. It was the spring of 1883, and Harlan Creek was the kind of town that existed in the seam between what the West used to be and what it was slowly, reluctantly becoming. The cattle trails were still churned to mud every season. The saloon still burned lamp oil past midnight, and the sheriff still wore his badge like a man who understood that law and justice were not always the same animal. But there were also a schoolhouse now, a proper one with real glass in the windows, and a telegraph office, and a woman named Augusta Underwood who ran the only general store with the kind of quiet authority that made men straighten their spines when they walked through her door. She was 26 years old, with dark copper hair that she pinned up sensibly every morning, green eyes that had a habit of seeing through things, and hands that were rougher than the schoolteacher's but steadier than any man's in town. She had inherited the store from her father, Thomas Underwood, who had died of pneumonia 2 winters prior, and she had run it alone since then with a stubbornness that some of the men in Harlan Creek called admirable and others called unfortunate, because it made her difficult to dismiss. Clarence Bristol, for his part, was 28 years old, with sun-darkened skin and dark eyes and the kind of lean, hard build that came from spending more time on horseback than under a roof. He had been working as a ranch hand out at the Delacroix spread for the better part of 2 years, doing honest work with his hands and his back, and not making much noise about it. He was known in town as reliable, quiet, and decent, which in Harlan Creek meant people trusted him to deliver messages and to settle disputes between horses, but did not yet invite him to their Sunday tables. He had been in love with Augusta Underwood for approximately 14 months, 3 weeks, and 5 days, not that he was counting. He had tried not to be. He had told himself, with considerable sincerity, that a woman like Augusta had no use for a ranch hand who slept in a bunkhouse and owned exactly 1 good shirt. He had told himself this while buying flour at her counter and watching her hands move efficiently over the ledger, while hearing her laugh at something old Mr. Pelham said and feeling the sound of it settle somewhere low in his chest, while noticing, in small accumulated ways, that she was the most genuinely interesting person he had encountered in his entire life. He had watched other men try their luck with her. Amos Garrett, the cattle broker, had sent her flowers twice and been politely refused. Deputy Hicks had asked her to the harvest dance and been turned down so gently that he had not even realized it at first. Even Gerald Forsyth, who owned the sawmill and had money enough to matter, had made his intentions plain and received from Augusta a smile that was warm and firm and final as a closed door. Clarence had watched all of this and understood that the problem was not that Augusta was cold. She was not cold. She was simply particular, and she had decided sometime before he'd ever come to Harlan Creek that her life was her own and she would not surrender it to someone who could not see her fully. He could see her fully. He was fairly certain of that. He was less certain he had any right to say so. What changed his mind was a horse, not a romantic horse, a terrified one. It was a Tuesday morning in late April when a spooked mare came tearing down the main street of Harlan Creek, with a child still clinging to her back. The child was Eli Prentice, who was 7 years old and had gotten onto the horse on a dare and was now screaming himself breathless. The street scattered in a chaos of shouting and ducking, and Augusta came running out of her store at the sound of it, and Clarence, who happened to be passing through on his way to the feed merchant, made a decision in the space of half a breath. He ran alongside the mare, got his hand on the bridle, dug his heels into the ground, and spoke to that horse in a low, even voice that cut right through the animal's terror. It took 50 yards and considerable effort and left him with a gash on his palm from the leather, but the mare slowed, and then stopped, and Eli Prentice tumbled off into Clarence's arms, shaking but unharmed. The whole street breathed again. Augusta had watched it all from the edge of the boardwalk, her hands gripped against her skirt, and when Clarence set the boy down safely and straightened up, Their eyes met across the dusty street. He was not looking at her like a man expecting applause. He was just looking at her, the way he sometimes did when he thought she wasn't paying attention, with something quiet and serious and honest in his face. She held his gaze for a moment, then pressed her lips together and went back inside her store. But she was thinking about it for the rest of the day. That evening, Clarence sat in the bunkhouse at the Delacroix spread and had a conversation with himself that had been a long time coming. His bunkmate, a rangy, good-natured fellow from Georgia named Porter Davis, listened from his cot with the patience of a man who had heard this conversation before. "You've been working up to something for a year and a half," Porter said, not looking up from the boot he was mending. "Just do the thing." "It isn't that simple," Clarence said. "It is exactly that simple. She's not spoken for, you're not spoken for, you think she hung the stars, and she clearly does not find you unpleasant to look at. That is not sufficient basis for asking a woman anything serious." "No," Porter agreed, "but loving her enough to make yourself sick over it is." Clarence was quiet for a while, listening to the night sounds of the ranch. Somewhere in the middle distance a coyote said something to the dark. "She deserves better than a ranch hand with no property," Clarence said. "Maybe she gets to decide what she deserves," Porter said. That landed differently than he expected. He sat with it a while. "Even if I were going to do something," Clarence said slowly, "I would want to do it properly. I would want to come to her door as something more than what I am right now." "Then become something more," Porter said in the easy way of a man who made everything sound obvious. "This is not complicated, Bristol. You have hands, you have a back, you have more good sense than most. Make a plan, work it. Then go tell the woman." It was not, in fact, a speech that solved anything. But it was enough to get Clarence moving in the direction he had been avoiding for too long. He spoke to Mr. Delacroix the following week and arranged to take on additional work building fencing for a neighboring property owner, a man named Cowboy who was expanding his grazing land. The extra wages were not a fortune, but they were a start. He began putting aside what he could, eating less at the saloon, spending less on anything that was not essential. He had a plan that was modest but real, which was to save enough to buy a small piece of land and a few head of cattle and begin building something that was his. He was also gathering courage, which proved harder than gathering money. The summer passed. He continued to come into Augusta's store for supplies, and they continued to have conversations that were polite and brisk, and on his side at least, full of things he was not saying. She sold him cornmeal and coffee and occasionally thread, and she asked him once about the scar on his palm from the mare incident, and he told her it had healed clean, and she said she was glad, and they looked at each other for a moment too long. He thought about that moment for 2 weeks. He also, in the course of that summer, began noticing other things about Augusta Underwood that deepened his regard for her in ways that were harder to dismiss. She extended credit to families that other merchants would have turned away, particularly the Mexican families and the freedmen who had settled in the area after the war. She did it quietly, without making a spectacle of charity, simply noting things in her ledger with a pragmatic air that suggested she expected to be repaid eventually, and was confident enough in people to wait. She stood up to a supply broker who tried to shortchange her on a shipment, and did it with a precision that left the man no ground to argue on. She read books, actual books, and she was not shy about it, keeping a volume behind the counter that she returned to between customers, and once he had seen her close it with the expression of a woman who had just been somewhere else entirely and was reluctantly returning. She was, he decided, the most remarkable person he had ever been privileged to know, and he was going to do something about that if it was the last thing he managed. The occasion that finally moved him from intention to action was a Wednesday evening in late September. He had been in town returning a borrowed wagon and was walking back down the main street when he saw Augusta through the window of her store, still working by lamplight long past the hour when she should have closed up. The store was dark at the edges and bright at the center where she sat, adding up figures with a focused expression, and she looked so completely alone that something in his chest simply decided it had waited long enough. He went home and talked to Porter, and Porter, with extraordinary generosity and without being asked twice, lent him his good suit. Porter was broader in the shoulder and shorter in the leg, which is why the suit fit Clarence the way it did, like something borrowed, which it was. But it was clean and dark and respectable, and Clarence wore it on a Saturday afternoon in early October of 1883, and walked the 2 miles from the Delacroix spread into Harlan Creek with his boots polished and his hat in his hand, and his heart conducting itself loudly behind his ribs. He arrived at her door at 2:30 in the afternoon. He knocked. There was a pause, and then the sound of footsteps, and then Augusta Underwood opened her door, not the store door but the door to the small house attached to the back of it where she lived, and she looked at him standing on her porch in that suit, hat in hand, and her expression moved through several things quickly. Surprise first, then something careful, then something that might have been the beginning of amusement, though she kept it under good control. "Mr. Bristol," she said. "Miss Underwood," he said. "I apologize for calling without notice. I have something I'd like to say to you, if you're willing to give me a few minutes of your time." She studied him for a moment. She studied the suit, which did not escape her notice. She studied the polished boots and the hat held in both hands and the expression on his face, which was the most honest expression she had ever seen on a man's face in her life, stripped entirely of performance or calculation. She stepped back from the door and let him in. The house was small and well-ordered, with a braid rug on the floor and a rocking chair by the window where a book was lying open, face down, the way you left a book when you expected to come back to it soon. There was coffee on the stove, and the smell of something baked earlier in the day still hanging pleasantly in the air. Augusta sat in the chair beside the window and watched him steadily. "You have the floor," she said. Clarence stood in the center of that small room and looked at her and said the most honest thing he had said in a long time. "I have been in love with you," he said, "for over a year. I know that may be difficult to hear, and I know I am not what anyone would call a man of means or standing. I came here today in a suit that belongs to my bunkmate because I wanted to stand in front of you like a man who had his life in order, but the truth is I'm not there yet. I'm working toward it. I have a plan and I am committed to it, and I believe I will get there." He paused. "But I thought," he continued carefully, "that it was dishonest to let more time pass without saying what I felt. Not because I expect anything from you, I don't. I just thought you deserved to know that there is a man in this town who thinks you are extraordinary, and that man is me." Augusta said nothing for a moment. A breeze came through the window and moved the curtain. "That is a borrowed suit," she said finally. "Yes, ma'am," he said. "I want to earn the real one." The silence that followed that sentence was the kind that had weight to it. Augusta looked at him with those green eyes that saw through things, and he stood steady under the weight of that look, not flinching, not embellishing, just present. "What is your plan?" she asked. The question surprised him because it was not the question he had expected. He had prepared himself for some version of rejection, something gentle and firm like the rejection she had handed others, and he had prepared himself to accept it without argument. He had not prepared himself for practical curiosity. "I have been saving wages," he said. "I have enough now for a modest parcel of land, small but workable, about 12 miles east on the flats. The Haverson family is selling and the price is reasonable. I would start with a few head of cattle and build from there. It is not grand, but it is real." Augusta tilted her head slightly. "You have been doing this all summer." "Yes," he said. "I've been doing this all summer." Another pause. She stood up from her chair, which seemed to indicate that something had shifted, and she crossed to the stove and poured 2 cups of coffee with the ease of a woman who had made that gesture 10,000 times in her life. She brought one to him, which he took, and she held her own and looked at him over the rim. "I will tell you something, Mr. Bristol," she said. "I have had men come to me with smooth speeches and fine suits that they owned themselves, and not one of them told me anything true. You came to my door in a borrowed suit and told me the truth, and I find that considerably more impressive than any of the alternatives." "Does that mean," he began. "It means," she said, "that I am willing to have a conversation with you, a proper one, over time, and we will see what we see." He nodded slowly. He wrapped both hands around the coffee cup. "I can do that," he said. "I expect you can," she said, and for the first time she let the beginning of a smile show properly, and it rearranged his entire understanding of what a good afternoon could be. He stayed for an hour and they talked. They talked about the store and about the ranch, and about a book she was reading that turned out to be one he had also read, which surprised them both in equal measure. They talked about her father and what it had been like to take on the store alone, and he listened without filling the air with reassurances, which she noted. They talked about his family back in Missouri and the reasons he had come west, which had more to do with needing open space than with any particular ambition for adventure, and she listened with the same quality of attention that he had given her. When he left, he walked back toward the Delacroix spread with the kind of lightness in his chest that he had not felt in a long time, maybe ever, and Porter Davis looked up from whatever he was doing when Clarence came through the door and read the whole story in his face. "Well," Porter said. "She gave me a chance," Clarence said. "That's more than you had this morning," Porter said. "That is considerably more than I had this morning," Clarence agreed. The weeks that followed were the most actively alive Clarence had felt since coming to Texas. He went to see Augusta on Sundays, always at her door, always with his boots clean and his manner respectful and his intentions plain. She always let him in. They sat in her small parlor and talked, and gradually the conversations deepened the way conversations do when two intelligent people are paying genuine attention to each other. They argued, sometimes, about things that mattered, and he found that he loved arguing with her because she was never dishonest in an argument, and she never changed her position because of social pressure, only because of actual reason, and he found that quality so rare as to be astonishing. She showed him the books she kept for the store one afternoon, not because she needed help, but because she wanted to show him who she was, the real operational self of her, the woman who had kept this business alive through drought and economic difficulty, and the specific challenge of being taken seriously in a field that assumed she would fail. He looked at those ledgers with genuine respect and told her so, and she said with characteristic plainness that she had not shown them to him for admiration. "Then why?" He asked. "Because I wanted you to see what you'd be dealing with," she said, "if this goes anywhere." "I see it," he said. "I am not frightened by competence." She looked at him steadily. "Most men are." "I am not most men," he said. It was not a boast. It was simply a statement, offered with enough quiet certainty that it landed differently than a boast. She looked at him for a moment longer than she usually allowed herself, and then she turned back to the ledgers. By November, he had saved enough to make a serious offer on the Haverson property, and he rode out to see the land on a bright cold morning with the wind sharp across the flats and the grass gone tawny with the turning season. The parcel was 40 acres, which was not large but was enough to begin with. There was a creek that ran along the eastern edge and a cluster of cottonwoods and the ruins of a small structure that had once been a house. He stood in the middle of it and looked at the sky and thought about what it could become, and the image he kept returning to involved Augusta Underwood standing in it, which was not something he pushed away. He put in the offer and it was accepted, and he signed papers with the land agent on a Friday afternoon and walked out of that office owning, for the first time in his life, a piece of ground that belonged to him. He went straight to Augusta's store. She was behind the counter when he came in, talking with a customer, and she glanced at him and read something in his face and said to the customer with perfect composure that she would be with him in one moment. When the customer left, she looked at Clarence directly. "You did it," she said. "Sign today," he said. She set her hands flat on the counter, and for a moment her expression was entirely open, all the careful control set aside, and what was underneath was something bright and deeply glad. "Tell me everything," she said. He told her about the land. He described the creek and the cottonwoods and the old foundation stones he planned to use to begin building, and she listened with her chin in her hand and her eyes moving over something only she could see, some internal geography that she was arranging and rearranging as he spoke. "The soil," she said, "toward the creek, is it clay or loam?" "More loam than clay," he said, slightly surprised. "The drainage is decent." "You could plant," she said, "not just graze. A kitchen garden at minimum, and if the water is consistent, maybe more." "I had not thought about that specifically," he said. "You should think about it," she said. "A man building something from nothing needs to think about all of it." He looked at her, and there was something between them in that moment, a current of shared vision, of two people looking at the same possibility from the same direction, that he felt all the way through him. "I would like to show it to you," he said. "The land. If you'd be willing to ride out with me. I'll ask Mrs. Prentice to come along if you think it's better that way." He said it without inflection, meaning genuinely that he would respect whatever she considered appropriate. She thought about it briefly. "Next Sunday," she said, "I'll ask Harriet Prentice." The following Sunday was cold and dry with a sky the color of old pewter, and Augusta came to the meeting point in front of the church at 9 in the morning wearing a dark riding coat and practical boots, and with her hair down from its usual pins into a single braid, and Clarence felt the sight of her like something physical. Harriet Prentice came along on her own small mare, brisk and good-humored and possessed of the excellent social instinct to ride far enough behind that she gave them privacy while being undeniably present. They rode east across the flats, and Clarence watched Augusta take in the landscape with those sharp eyes of hers, noting things, reading the land the way she read everything for information. When they reached the property and rode to the center of it, she pulled her horse to a stop and looked around for a long time without speaking. "The cottonwoods," she said finally. "That's where you'd build the house." "That's where I'd build the house," he agreed. She looked at the creek, and then at the old foundation stones, and then she turned her horse in a slow circle, taking in the whole of it. "It's good land," she said. "You chose well." "I chose it because I could see what it could be," he said, which was true on more than one level, and she heard both levels. He could tell by the way her expression shifted slightly. They rode back to town with Harriet behind them, and somewhere on that ride, the last of the careful, formal distance between them began quietly closing. They talked about everything and nothing, the habits of horses and the problems with the telegraph line that kept going down between Harlan Creek and the next town, and whether the schoolteacher, Mr. Briggs, was as good as the children needed. And in between the things they talked about there was an ease that had not been there before, a sense of two people who had found their rhythm together and were no longer surprised by it. At the edge of town, Harriet Prentice rode ahead to see to her children, and Clarence and Augusta came into Harlan Creek riding side by side, which the town noticed and would discuss at length, but neither of them was thinking about the town. He walked her to her door, as had become his habit, and she turned to him with her back to the door and her arms folded against the cold, and looked at him with a directness that she did not try to soften. "Clarence," she said, using his given name for the first time, and the sound of it from her was remarkable enough that he went entirely still. "Yes," he said. "I am not a woman who does things part way," she said. "I want you to know that, whatever this is, I'm doing it with my whole self or not at all." "I know that about you," he said softly. "I've known that about you for a long time." "Good," she said. "Then you know what you're getting into." She held his gaze for one more moment, then turned and opened her door and went inside, and he stood on her porch in the October cold and felt the world rearrange itself around a new center. Winter in West Texas was not the brutal thing it was in the northern territories, but it had its own severity, a dry, cutting cold that crept under doors and made the horses miserable and left the landscape stripped and gray. Clarence spent the winter months working the Delacroix spread during the week and spending his Sundays with Augusta, and he also spent every free hour he had out on his land, pulling up old fence posts and salvaging the foundation stones, and doing the preliminary work of clearing space for a building. Augusta came out twice more over the winter, each time with Harriet Prentice, and each time she looked at the progress he had made and asked the right questions and offered observations that were so consistently useful that he began to rely on her perspective not as a courtesy, but as a genuine resource. She had, it turned out, thought a great deal about land and building, having watched her father build the store from an idea into a functioning business, and she had a practical mind that could move between the big picture and the small detail without losing either. They also had their first real argument that winter, which in its own way was as significant as the first time she had smiled at him properly. It was in January, and it concerned credit. A family named Aguirre, a Mexican family with 4 children who had a small homestead east of town, had fallen behind significantly on their account at the store. The husband, Miguel Aguirre, had broken his hand badly in a farming accident and could not work through most of the autumn, and the debt had accumulated to the point where Augusta's books showed it clearly as a problem. Clarence had been looking over her ledger when he noticed it, not uninvited. She had shown it to him herself, and he said, with what he thought was reasonable practicality, that perhaps she needed to cut them off until the debt was addressed. Augusta looked at him with a temperature in her eyes that he had not previously encountered. "Miguel Aguirre has 4 children," she said, very evenly. "I know that," he said, "but the debt is, his hand is healed now," she said. "He has come to me and told me exactly what he can pay back and over what period, and I believe him because I know that man, and I know that family, and I know they are not careless. They had an accident. That is not the same thing as being a bad risk. It is your business and your decision," he said carefully. "I am not telling you what to do." "No," she said, "but you are telling me what you think, and what you think is that the numbers matter more than the people behind them." That landed. He was quiet for a moment. "That's not what I think," he said. "That is not what I actually think. You're right. I spoke without thinking it through. I'm sorry." She had been braced for more argument, he could tell, because his apology visibly surprised her. She looked at him for a moment, recalibrating. "The Aguirres will pay their account," she said more quietly. "I am confident of it." "I believe you," he said, and he meant it, because if Augusta Underwood was confident of something, he had come to trust that confidence. They did not speak of it again, and the Aguirre family paid their debt by March, in full, with a jar of their mother's preserved peppers set on Augusta's counter alongside the last payment. The argument mattered, though, not because of what they had disagreed about, but because of what happened after it. He had been wrong and admitted it without performing agony about it, and she had been ready to hold her ground and had not needed to because he had moved. They had come through it and come out the other side, and the knowing that they could do that was worth more than an afternoon of comfortable agreement. By February, he had said, quietly during one of their Sunday evenings, that he loved her. Not the formal declaration he had made on her porch in the borrowed suit, which had been necessary and real, but also partially a speech. This was just 3 words in the middle of a regular conversation, said because they were true, and because not saying them had begun to feel dishonest. She had been quiet for a long moment, and then she had said, equally quietly, that she loved him too, and the way she said it was the way she said everything important, without ornamentation, with complete sincerity, like a fact. He had reached across the table and taken her hand, and she had let him hold it, and they had sat like that for a while in the lamplight of her small house, and it was one of the finest things he had ever experienced. Spring came back to Harlan Creek the way it always did, all at once and too warm, the grass going green in days and the creek on Clarence's land running full and cold. He had by now cleared the building site and put up 4 walls of what would eventually be a proper house, working on weekends with Porter Davis and occasionally with Miguel Aguirre, who had offered his labor in friendship and could not be refused. The walls were not finished inside, and there was no floor yet beyond the packed earth, and the roof was a work in progress, but it was standing. Augusta came to see it on a Sunday in April, this time without Harriet, because by now the town understood what was happening between them and had collectively arrived at the conclusion that it was none of their business, which was approximately accurate. She stood in the unfinished doorway of the house he was building and looked around at the walls and the light coming in and the view through the gap where the window would eventually go, which was the creek and the cottonwoods and the wide Texas sky. "It's going to be beautiful," she said. "It's going to take another year at least," he said honestly. "I know that," she said. "Beautiful things take time." He looked at her standing in the doorway of his house, with the April light on her face and her eyes going over everything with that particular way she had of seeing. "Augusta," he said. She looked at him. "I would like to marry you," he said. "I am ready to offer you something worthy of what you are. I am not there yet, but I wanted you to know that is where I am headed, and I wanted you to be certain of it." She was quiet for a moment, and the breeze came through the open window gap and moved a strand of hair across her face, and she pushed it back with one hand. "When you are ready," she said, "ask me properly, and I will tell you yes." "You're certain," he said. "I told you," she said with the ghost of that smile. "I don't do things part way." The summer of 1884 was the summer Harlan Creek had the kind of trouble that every Texas town dreaded, which was to say a man named Duval, who was a cattle broker of questionable ethics and considerable confidence, who arrived with 3 hired hands and began making arrangements that pressed very hard on the edges of the law. He had deals with some of the larger landowners that squeezed the smaller operations, and he had a specific interest in Augusta's store, which he wanted to buy at a price she called insulting, and he called reasonable, and everyone in between called low. He came into the store twice in the first week of July, both times with the easy manner of a man who expected to be accommodated, and both times Augusta declined with a precision that left him no room to argue with and no ground to feel offended by, because she was too good at this to give him anything to push against. He came a third time on a Thursday afternoon when Clarence happened to be in the store buying rope, and this time Duval brought a different manner with him, less easy, more pressing, and Augusta matched him point for point with a calm that Clarence watched with absolute admiration while staying very still near the rope display. Duval left. Clarence looked at Augusta across the store, and she looked back at him. "Are you all right?" he said. "I am perfectly all right," she said, though her hands, he noticed, were gripping the counter edge somewhat firmly. "He is a bully with a briefcase. I have dealt with worse." "Has he made any threats?" Clarence asked carefully. "Nothing that can be taken directly as a threat," she said. "But he has friends on the county council, and I believe he is working toward finding some leverage that is legal in form and unjust in intent." Clarence nodded slowly. This was a different kind of problem than a spooked horse or a man wanting to fight in a saloon. This was the kind of problem that needed a different kind of response. He went to speak with Sheriff Alderman the following day, not on Augusta's behalf. He had checked with her first, and she had agreed it was reasonable. The sheriff, who was a measured man with good judgment, said he had had his own concerns about Duval and was watching the situation carefully. He also said, with the directness of a man who respected both parties, that Augusta Underwood was the most formidable businessperson in Harlan Creek, regardless of gender, and that he doubted Duval had correctly assessed what he was dealing with. What Duval was working toward, it turned out, was a matter of a water rights claim that someone on the county council had helped him file against property that bordered Augusta's, a claim that, if validated, would limit her access to the shared irrigation channel that several properties in town depended on. It was exactly what Augusta had anticipated, legal in form and unjust in intent. Augusta responded by going to see the land agent herself, then writing 2 letters, one to a lawyer in San Antonio and one to the county recorder, and presenting a counterclaim based on her father's original property deed that established a prior right to the irrigation access. She did all of this methodically, without panic, over the course of 2 weeks, while continuing to run her store as if nothing out of the ordinary was occurring. Clarence helped where he could, which was mostly in the form of writing messages to town and back, and providing a second set of eyes on documents, because Augusta wanted to be certain she had read everything correctly. He was not a lawyer, and he told her so, and she said she knew that, but that she valued the way he thought. The matter was resolved in Augusta's favor in August, when the county recorder upheld her prior right claim. Duval packed up his operation and moved on to trouble some other town, and Harlan Creek quietly celebrated by not saying anything much about it, which was the local manner. Augusta, for her part, sat in her parlor on the Sunday after the resolution came through, with the letter from the county recorder in her hands and her shoulders finally, visibly, releasing the tension they had been carrying for the better part of 2 months. "Done," she said. "Done," Clarence agreed. She set the letter down and looked at him, and he saw something in her eyes that was not the usual composed directness but something more open, something that showed the effort it had taken. "I was frightened," she said. "I didn't let myself feel it fully until now, but I was frightened. My father built that store. His life was in those walls. The thought of losing it, I know," he said. "I didn't let it show," she said. "I know," he said again quietly. "You held it together because it needed to be held together. You were extraordinary." She looked at him for a moment, and then she crossed the room and sat beside him on the small settle and leaned her head against his shoulder, which was the most she had allowed herself to lean on anyone in a very long time. He put his arm around her and held her carefully, the way you hold something that is both strong and worth protecting, and they sat like that while the afternoon light moved across the floor. "Clarence," she said. "Yes." "The house," she said. "On your land. When do you think the roof will be finished?" He thought about it honestly. "October if the weather holds." "Good," she said, and that was all she said, but the way she said it told him everything. He asked her properly on a Saturday afternoon in September of 1884, on his land, by the creek under the cottonwoods, which were just beginning to turn yellow in the first breath of autumn. He had bought a ring, a modest one from the jeweler in the next town over, a slender gold band with a small turquoise stone that was pretty without being extravagant, which was exactly right. He went down on one knee in the grass by the creek, which felt slightly ridiculous and completely necessary, and he said her name and looked up at her, and said that he loved her, and that he believed they were better together than either of them was separately, which was the most honest case he could make for a life with her. She looked down at him with those green eyes, and she said yes before he had quite finished the sentence, which made him laugh, which made her laugh, and then she took his hands and pulled him up, and he kissed her for the first time, there by the creek under the cottonwoods, with the yellow leaves falling around them and the sky enormous and blue overhead. It was a very good kiss. It was the kind of kiss that answered questions that had been waiting a long time to be answered. They were married in December of 1884, in the Harlan Creek Church, which was small and plain and full of people, because Augusta was known to everyone in town, and Clarence had quietly earned more regard than he had realized over the course of his 2 years in Harlan Creek. Harriet Prentice stood up with Augusta, and Porter Davis stood up with Clarence, and Miguel Aguirre and his wife sat in the second row, and their children spent most of the ceremony being quietly managed by their mother. Augusta wore a dress that she had made herself from blue wool because it was December and she was practical, and she wore her hair pinned differently than usual, with small flowers from a dried arrangement that had been her mother's. She looked, Clarence thought, as he stood waiting for her at the front of the church, like the most beautiful and real thing he had ever seen in his life. She walked toward him without hesitation, the way she did everything, and when she reached him she took his hands and looked at him steadily, and the minister said the words, and they said their own words, and when it was finished, Clarence took her face in his hands very gently and kissed her again, and the church made a sound like a collective exhale of satisfaction. They had a small reception at the hotel, where Porter Davis gave a speech that was brief and sincere and made Augusta laugh twice, which was a significant accomplishment. Miguel Aguirre brought food that his wife had prepared, and Mrs. Prentice brought a cake, and someone produced a fiddle from somewhere, and there was dancing until late in the evening, and Augusta danced with Clarence in the cleared center of the hotel's dining room, and he held her as if he had all the time in the world and intended to use it. He had, before the wedding, bought himself a proper suit. Not borrowed, not someone else's size, but his own, made by the tailor in San Antonio, where he had gone for 2 days in November on a cattle errand for Delacroix and taken the opportunity to be measured. It was dark wool and fit him correctly, and when he had come home to the ranch and put it on and stood in the small bit of mirror in the bunkhouse, Porter had looked at him and said, "Now you look like a man who knows what he's doing." And Clarence had felt the truth of that in a way that had nothing to do with the suit and everything to do with what the suit represented. He thought of it when he stood at the altar. He had earned the real one. The house on the property was finished by February of 1885, which was 2 months later than October but was still winter, which was not ideal for finishing work. And it was small but solid, 2 rooms and a loft, with the floor he had laid himself and the window that looked out toward the creek and the cottonwoods. Augusta moved into it with the deliberateness of a woman who had been thinking about it for a while, placing her books on the shelf he had built for them, and her mother's few good plates in the kitchen cabinet, and her own self into the house, as if she were exactly the right size for it, which she was. She also did not give up the store. This had been a point of discussion between them, not an argument exactly, but a conversation that needed to happen. He had not expected her to give it up, he knew better than that, but he had wanted to make certain she knew he did not expect it of her, and she had said, with characteristic directness, that she appreciated that, and that the store was hers and she intended to keep it, and that she planned to ride into town 3 days a week, and that Dolores Medina, who was the 17-year-old daughter of a Mexican family in town and had been working part-time, would pick up more hours on the other days. "Dolores is reliable," Augusta said. "She has a good head for numbers and she is honest with customers in a way they respond to." "Then that sounds like a good arrangement," Clarence said. "It is a good arrangement," Augusta said. "I thought of it." He smiled, which she saw. The early spring of 1885 was the first time Augusta told him she was going to have a baby. She told him on a Tuesday morning before he went out to check the cattle, matter-of-factly, with a cup of coffee in each hand, handing him his and keeping hers and watching his face while he absorbed what she had said. His face went through several things: surprise, then something vivid and bright, then something quieter and more serious. "Are you certain?" he said. "I would not say it if I weren't certain," she said. He set the coffee down and crossed the kitchen and took her hands, and he looked at her with such complete and uncomplicated joy that it made her eyes sting, which she was not expecting. "Augusta," he said. "I know," she said. "We're going to be all right," he said. "We were already all right," she said. "We are going to be better." He laughed, and she pressed her face briefly against his shoulder, and the cottonwoods were green outside the window, and the creek was running full with the spring melt, and the world was, in every sense that mattered, beginning. The pregnancy was not without its difficulties. Augusta, who had expected to be practical about it, found herself struck by a tiredness in the first months that she resented and could not entirely manage. She continued to go into town on her 3 days but cut the hours shorter, and she ate better than she had ever forced herself to eat before, because the stakes were different now. Clarence was attentive without being suffocating, which was the precise calibration that made it bearable, bringing her what she needed before she asked for it, and not making a production of the gesture. She read everything she could find about what was happening to her body, which was not extensive given the available literature in Harlan Creek in 1885, and she had long conversations with Harriet Prentice, who had 3 children, and was the most useful source of practical information within 30 miles. In the evenings, Clarence and Augusta sat on the porch they had added to the house in late spring, watching the last light leave the sky and the stars come in. And they talked about the future in specific terms, names and arrangements and the expansion of the cattle operation, and the garden that Augusta had planted along the south side of the house, which was producing tomatoes and beans and a profusion of mint that threatened to take over. "If it's a boy," Clarence said one evening, "I thought perhaps Thomas." "For your father." Augusta was quiet for a moment. She had not expected him to say that, and the consideration of it moved through her in a way that surprised her. "Thomas," she said. "If you'd like," he said. "It doesn't have to be." "I would like that," she said softly. "Very much." He took her hand in the evening dark and held it, and neither of them said anything else for a while, and the night came down over the Texas plain, and the cattle moved in the distant dark, and it was exactly the life they had meant to build. Thomas Underwood Bristol was born in November of 1885, during a cold, clear stretch of weather that kept the sky bright and the ground hard. He arrived without excessive drama, attended by Harriet Prentice, who had served as midwife for half the babies in Harlan Creek. And he was a solid, healthy boy with his mother's eyes and his father's hands, which Harriet pronounced a lucky combination. Clarence, who had been outside with Porter Davis for the better part of 8 hours, came in when Harriet called him and stood in the doorway of the bedroom and looked at Augusta, who was exhausted and shining and holding their son, and said absolutely nothing, because there were no words that were useful enough. So he simply crossed the room and sat beside her and looked at the baby, and then at his wife. And Augusta watched him and understood from the expression on his face everything that he was feeling. "Hello, Thomas," Clarence said quietly to the baby, who was not listening, being occupied with more immediate concerns. "Hello, Thomas," Augusta echoed, and they looked at each other over their son's head, and it was one of those moments that does not need annotation. The store continued to thrive through 1886 and into 1887, with Dollar's Medina having proved herself so entirely reliable that Augusta promoted her to a position of genuine responsibility, which in practice meant that Dollar's ran the store on the days Augusta was not there with full authority to make decisions. Dollar's, who was now 19, and had the kind of quiet competence that would have taken a man half as long again to be believed in, accepted this responsibility with seriousness. Augusta had made a point of ensuring she was paid accordingly, which was not the common practice but was Augusta's practice. There was a conversation Augusta had with Dollar's one afternoon in the spring of 1887 that stayed with her. Dollar's had mentioned carefully that a man in the county seat had been asking questions about the store, whether it was truly owned solely by a woman, whether the property was encumbered, the kind of questions that were not accidental. "Who is the man?" Augusta said. Dollar's gave her a name she did not know, but the pattern was familiar enough. She was not alarmed because she had been through this before, but she was not careless about it. She wrote another letter to the lawyer in San Antonio who had helped her with the water rights matter, and she had her documents in order before any formal inquiry arrived, and when it did arrive, in the form of a letter from the county seat that was precisely as problematic as she had anticipated, she was prepared. She told Clarence that evening and he listened, and then he said something that struck her. "Is there anything I can do that would actually help?" he said. "Not just be present." Actually help? She thought about it honestly. "You could ride to the county seat with me on Thursday," she said, "not to speak for me. But there are men who will take longer to dismiss something when another man is present. I dislike that it is true, but I am willing to use it when it is useful." "Then I'll ride with you on Thursday," he said, without editorializing. They rode to the county seat on Thursday, and Clarence sat beside Augusta while she presented her case to the county recorder, and he said very little because very little needed to be said, but his presence had the effect she had calculated, and the matter was dealt with more quickly and more conclusively than it might otherwise have been. On the ride home, Augusta said, "I will not always need that." "I know," he said. "But it helped," she said. "It helped," he agreed. She looked at the road ahead of them, the late afternoon light coming across the plain at a low angle, turning everything golden. "It shouldn't be necessary," she said. "No," he said quietly. "It shouldn't. The world is slower to correct than it ought to be." She looked at him sideways. "You are an unusual man, Clarence Bristol." "You are an unusual woman, Augusta Bristol," he said. She smiled, and they rode home side by side. And Thomas was waiting with Harriet Prentice, who had been minding him. And he was 18 months old and just beginning to walk in the determined, experimental way of young children. And he lurched toward his parents when they came through the door with an expression of absolute satisfaction at having managed it. Life on the land moved in rhythms that Clarence found deeply satisfying. The cattle operation had grown, slowly and carefully, from the few head he had started with to a small but functional herd. He had hired a hand in the spring of 1887, a young man named Jackson who was 17 and enormously willing to work, and who learned quickly and had a good instinct for animals. Clarence treated him fairly and paid him what the work was worth and taught him what he knew, because he had been young and learning once and had been helped by men who expected nothing back, and he understood that this was how things ought to go. The land itself had responded to care. The garden that Augusta had planted had expanded each year, and now there was a proper kitchen garden and a small orchard of young peach trees that she had sent away for, which would need another 2 years to produce, but would, she said, produce well. The house had been added to, a proper bedroom for Thomas and a second room that served as a sitting room in the evenings, and the porch had been widened. And in general, the property had acquired the settled, particular look of a place where people lived genuinely. Porter Davis had left the Delacroix spread in 1886 and gone back to Georgia to see to his aging mother. And there had been a proper farewell, the kind where everyone was careful not to make too much of the emotion of it. Porter had shaken Clarence's hand and hugged Augusta with the straightforward warmth of a man who knew the value of good people. And he had looked at Thomas and said that Thomas had his mother's expression, which was the finest compliment he could have given. And then he had ridden south toward the railhead, and that was the last Harlan Creek saw of him. Clarence wrote to him twice a year, and Porter wrote back when he could, which was less regularly, and the letters, brief and plain, maintained the thread of a friendship that had genuinely mattered. The summer of 1888 brought the second pregnancy, which Augusta announced with the same directness as the first, this time across the breakfast table with Thomas eating his porridge beside her and ignoring the entire conversation. "Another one," Clarence said. "Another one," she confirmed. He looked at Thomas, who looked back at him with the self-contained expression of a 2-year-old who had more going on inside than he was currently reporting, and then Clarence looked at Augusta, and the joy was the same as before, simple and full. "Thomas," Augusta said, "you are going to have a brother or sister." Thomas considered this information and returned to his porridge. "He'll warm to it," Clarence said. "He warms to everything eventually," Augusta said. "He is very like you in that regard." "And impatient with everything initially," Clarence said, "which is very like you." She looked at him with narrowed eyes that were not actually dangerous, and he looked back with the steadiness of a man who knew exactly where the line was and how to stand comfortable just on this side of it. The second child, born in March of 1889 after a winter that had been genuinely cold and somewhat relentless, was a girl. They named her Clara, after no one in particular, but with the sense that the name was simply right, and she was different from Thomas in the first hour. Louder and more expressive and possessed of an opinion about everything that she did not hesitate to communicate. Thomas, who was 3, inspected her with the serious attention of a scientist examining a new specimen, and then patted her hand with one finger, very gently, and seemed satisfied. "He likes her," Harriet said. "He is reserving judgment," Augusta said, but she was watching Thomas with the expression she kept for things she found deeply right. The years from 1889 into 1891 were the years of building, in every sense. The cattle operation continued to grow under Clarence's steady management, and Jackson had become a genuine ranch hand who could be trusted with the herd through the night, and was starting to have ideas about how to run things that were worth listening to. The store flourished under Augusta and Dollars, and there had been a conversation between them about the future of the business, whether Dollars might eventually take a partnership in it, which was the direction the conversation was tending. Harlan Creek itself was changing, the way all the West Texas towns were changing in those years, with the railroad getting closer and the cattle trails shifting, and the old frontier patterns giving way to something more settled and more connected to the rest of the country. It was not entirely comfortable, this change, and not everyone welcomed it, but Augusta watched it with her customary clear eyes and thought about what it meant for the store, and Clarence watched it with the eyes of a man whose cattle would eventually need to reach a market by rail rather than trail, and thought about what that meant for the ranch. They talked about it often, on the porch in the evenings or at the kitchen table after the children were in bed, working through the implications of things they could not yet see fully, which was the ongoing project of two people building something together in conditions that kept shifting. It was not always easy. There were months that were financially tight and months when the weather did not cooperate with any plan anyone had made, and there were conversations that were difficult and needed to be had anyway. But there was never a moment, not one, when Clarence doubted that Augusta was his partner in every sense that mattered, or when Augusta doubted that Clarence was exactly who he had told her he was, that first day on her porch, wearing a borrowed suit and telling her the truth. By the spring of 1891, the ranch had 12 acres under fence and a small but productive herd, and Augusta had negotiated with Dollars Medina, who was now 24 and had been running the store for 3 years in all practical terms, a partnership arrangement that gave Dollars a share of the business in exchange for a modest investment she had been saving toward and her continued management. The papers were drawn up by the lawyer in San Antonio, who by now was practically a regular correspondent, and they were signed on a Thursday afternoon in the store, with both women's hands steady on the pen. Augusta came home that evening with something different in her face, something resolved and satisfied. "Done," Clarence said. "Done," she said. "Dollars owns a quarter of the store and she has earned every fraction of it." "And you," he said. "I own 3/4 of a business that someone else is largely running for me," she said, "and that frees me to think about what I want to do next." He looked at her with interest. "And what do you want to do next?" She sat down across from him at the kitchen table and put her hands flat on it and looked at him with the expression she had when she was presenting something she had been thinking about for a while. "The schoolhouse," she said. "Mr. Briggs is retiring in the fall and no one has found a replacement. I have been thinking about the curriculum those children are getting or not getting as the case may be, and I believe I could do better." He was quiet for a moment, genuinely thinking about it. "You have no formal training as a teacher," he said. "I have no formal training as a merchant either," she said. "And yet—" "True," he said. "And yet," she looked at him steadily, "you think it's a good idea." "I think it is entirely like you," he said, "and I think the children of Harlan Creek are lucky that you have arrived at this point." She looked at him for a moment, and then she said, "Thomas needs someone who will push him. He is too much like me, which means he will coast on what comes easily unless someone makes it worth his while to reach further." "He has you," Clarence said. "He will have me in a classroom," she said, "which is different and probably better." She became the schoolteacher of Harlan Creek in September of 1891, which caused considerable discussion in town and considerable relief among the parents who had been worried about the vacancy. She was not easy on the students. She was fair and consistent and demanding and generous with her knowledge, which was considerable, and the children responded to her with the mixture of respect and genuine affection that good teachers earn. Thomas, who was 5 and starting school himself that fall, had the peculiar experience of his mother as his teacher, and handled it with the same studied composure he handled most things, which was to pretend it was entirely normal while being secretly proud of a fact he could not have articulated. Clara, who was 2, spent those school days with Clarence at the ranch, which meant she was underfoot in a way that he accommodated with good humor, and which meant she developed, over the following years, a thorough understanding of cattle and horses that would have surprised people who did not know her father. 1892 brought a development that Clarence had not anticipated, a letter from his older brother Edmund in Missouri, who had fallen on difficult times after a failed business venture and asked, without much preamble, whether there was work in Texas. Clarence wrote back honestly, which was that the work was hard and the pay was modest, but that a man who was willing to learn could build something here if he committed to it. Edmund arrived in April, thinner than Clarence remembered and somewhat chastened, and Clarence hired him at the ranch alongside Jackson. It was not always smooth. Edmund had opinions about how things should be run that did not always match Clarence's, and there were conversations between them that were sharp at the edges, as conversations between brothers sometimes are. But Edmund was not a bad man, only a man who had been knocked sideways and needed time to find his footing, and under Clarence's steady management, and with the example of what Clarence and Augusta had built, he gradually found it. Augusta received Edmund with the particular warmth she reserved for people who were struggling, which was different from pity, and he could tell the difference. And this was perhaps what helped most of all. By the fall of 1892, Edmund had saved enough to rent a small place of his own in town, and was courting a woman from the next county who came to visit Harlan Creek and found she liked it well enough to stay. Her name was Rose, and she was steady and practical and could make Edmund laugh in a way that Clarence recognized was rare and worth protecting, and he told Edmund so privately, and Edmund looked at him and said, "I know, I know." Edmund and Rose were married in 1893, and Augusta and Clarence stood up for them, and it was a small and genuine celebration. And afterward the 4 of them sat on the porch of Clarence and Augusta's house late into the evening, talking about nothing in particular, and it was the kind of evening that does not need anything added to it. Thomas was 7 in 1893, and he had inherited his mother's love of books and his father's patience for learning things correctly, and he was reading well beyond what Mr. Briggs, in his time, would have expected. Augusta taught him at school and taught him at home both, which he bore with the equanimity of a child who simply accepted that learning was what you did, and Clara was 4 and had opinions about horses that needed to be addressed practically. So Clarence began teaching her to ride on the smallest, most patient horse on the property, a bay pony named Biscuit who had infinite tolerance. The image of Clara on Biscuit, small and determined, her expression fierce with concentration, her father walking alongside with his hand near the rein, not holding it unless needed, is the kind of image that parents carry in a particular place, the place where the best things are kept. Augusta watched it from the fence one Saturday afternoon in the spring of 1893, and she was thinking about something she had been thinking about for a while, which was that she was happy. She had spent a fair portion of her life being capable and determined and sufficient, and those were fine things. She did not dismiss them, but she had not known if this other thing, this particular warmth of a life built together with someone who genuinely saw her, was something she would be able to find or to trust. She had been afraid in the quiet parts of herself that it was too much to ask for. Standing at the fence watching Clarence and Clara, she thought about the morning she had opened her door and found a man on her porch in a borrowed suit, telling her the truth. She had made the right call. She had known it then, she thought. She had known it in the quality of his honesty, which was the same quality she had demanded of herself all her life and had rarely found in another person. She walked out to the fence and Clarence looked up from where he was guiding Biscuit in a slow circle, and he smiled at her, which was the smile she had only ever seen him give her, the one that did not perform anything but simply express something. "She's getting it," he said. "I can see that," Augusta said. "I'm getting it," Clara announced from the back of Biscuit with enormous satisfaction. "We know," both her parents said, and they looked at each other over Clara's head, and the afternoon was everything. The summer of 1894 was the year the railroad finally reached close enough to Harlan Creek to matter, with a spur line being established 12 miles to the south that made shipping cattle considerably more practical than the trail drives had been. Clarence adapted to it with less resistance than some of the older cattlemen in the area, because he had been watching the change coming and had been thinking about how to use it rather than lamenting what it replaced. He shipped his first cattle by rail in September of 1894 and stood at the loading pens watching the process with the complicated satisfaction of a man who has learned to be glad for progress even when it feels strange. He wrote to Porter Davis about it, and Porter wrote back from Georgia that he was glad to hear it, and that the South was also changing faster than he'd expected, and that his mother was well, and he had married a woman named Judith who had good sense and a laugh you could hear 3 houses away, and that he hoped someday to come through Texas and take supper with Clarence and Augusta, an invitation that was given with complete sincerity. By 1895, the ranch had grown to the point where Clarence was considering expanding the land holdings, a second parcel adjacent to the first that would increase his grazing capacity significantly. He and Augusta spent several evenings going over the figures together at the kitchen table, which was how they made all significant decisions, with the facts on the table and both of them looking at them. "The risk is manageable," Augusta said, "if the next 2 seasons are reasonable." "If," Clarence said. "There is always an if," she said. "You manage the risk, you do not eliminate it. That has always been true." "You think we should do it," he said. "I think the opportunity is good and our foundation is strong," she said. "I think we have built carefully enough that this is the right time to build further. But it is your decision, Clarence. It is your ranch." He looked at her across the table. "It is our ranch," he said. She met his eyes and there was a moment between them. "Our ranch," she agreed. He bought the second parcel in the spring of 1896, and the expansion went into it steadily over the following year. And by the fall of 1897, the Bristol Ranch was a going concern that commanded respect in the county and provided consistent work for Jackson, who was now 27 and had become a fixture as irreplaceable as the fence posts, and 2 additional hands. Thomas was 11 in 1897, and he was the kind of boy who asked questions that required real answers, which his parents provided without condescension, and who was already thinking about what he wanted to do with his life, with the seriousness of a child who had been raised by 2 people who took their own choices seriously. He helped on the ranch on Saturdays, and he read everything the school library had, and he was beginning to ask about what happened after school, about learning beyond what Harlan Creek could offer. Augusta had been thinking about this. "There's a school in San Antonio," she said to Clarence one evening. "Preparatory, proper curriculum. In a few years he could board there." "That's a long way from home," Clarence said. "It is," she agreed. "And it would be right for him." Clarence thought about it. He thought about the boy they had made, the quality of his curiosity and the reach of his mind, and he thought about what it meant to give a child what they needed even when it cost you something. "We have time yet," he said. "But yes, if that's what he needs." Thomas, when he was told, received the information with the seriousness with which he received all information, and then asked a series of questions about the school that were so specific and so well considered that both his parents were surprised and not surprised. Clara, who was 8 and present for this conversation, said that she had no intention of going anywhere and would stay and run the horses, which she delivered as a matter of settled fact. Clarence looked at Augusta, and Augusta looked at Clarence, and they managed not to smile until Clara had left the room. The years turned. The store under Dollars Medina's primary management continued to serve Harlan Creek well, and Augusta continued to teach, and the school grew as the town grew, and she hired an assistant teacher in 1898, a young woman named Margaret who had trained in Dallas and came to Harlan Creek with good intentions and considerable nervousness that Augusta helped her past. The land was productive and the cattle were healthy, and the house had been added to again. A proper room for Clara and a study for Augusta where she kept her books and did her preparation, and where in the evenings she and Clarence sometimes sat together, each with a book, the lamp between them, in a silence that was entirely comfortable. There is a specific kind of happiness that does not announce itself, that does not feel like the happiness of arrival, full and triumphant, but like the happiness of being in the right place in the right life, which you recognize because everything fits together without force. Augusta had known how to want things. What she had learned, slowly and with some surprise, was how to inhabit what she had wanted after it became real. Clarence had always known how to be present. What he had needed to learn was that being present was enough, that the quiet, consistent substance of his love was not a lesser thing than the grand gesture, that turning up every day, steadily and honestly and with his whole heart, was the real thing. He was the suit he had earned. He wore it every day. Thomas left for the preparatory school in San Antonio in 1900, at 14, which was older than Augusta had originally planned but was right in the end, because the year of extra preparation had served him well. They drove him to the railhead in September, all four of them, and Clara held his arm at the platform and said, with the practicality of a 10-year-old who had organized her feelings thoroughly, that she would write to him on Tuesdays. "Tuesdays," Thomas said. "Tuesdays," she confirmed. Clarence shook his son's hand and then pulled him in briefly, one-armed, the way men do when they cannot quite say what they mean. Thomas, who was taller than Augusta now, and almost as tall as Clarence, held on for a moment before stepping back. Augusta looked at her son on the platform, this boy she had watched since he was an hour old, and she said the most useful thing she could think of, which was, "You know who you are. Don't forget it." "I won't," he said, and she believed him, because he was her son and he had her stubbornness, and he knew himself the way she had always known herself, from the inside out. He boarded the train and they watched it leave, and then they drove back to the ranch in the September evening, the three of them, and Clara sat in the back of the wagon with her arms crossed and her expression composed, and about 3 miles down the road she said, "I'm not going to cry." "Of course not," Clarence said. "Neither am I," Augusta said. There was a pause. "Good," Clara said. The 20th century came to Harlan Creek in the way new centuries came to small towns, which is to say it arrived and was noticed and remarked upon, and then the daily business of living continued, because life does not rearrange itself for calendars. There were changes, visible ones. The automobile was something people were beginning to talk about, though none had arrived in Harlan Creek yet, and the telegraph had been supplemented by telephone lines in the larger towns, and the patterns of the cattle trade were continuing to shift. But on the Bristol ranch in the spring of 1901, the morning began the same way it had always begun, with the horses needing attention and the coffee needing to be made, and Clara, who was 12 and had become an accomplished rider, already out in the paddock before breakfast with Biscuit, who was old and slow now, but still seemed to understand her better than anyone. Augusta stood on the porch with her coffee in the early light, watching the day come in over the land, and Clarence came out and stood beside her, and they looked at their ranch together in the morning light, the house they had built and the fence lines and the cattle in the near pasture and the cottonwoods down by the creek that had grown considerably in 17 years and now made a proper shade. "You know," Clarence said, "when I walked up your porch in that suit, I thought you were going to close the door in my face." "I thought about it," she said. He looked at her. "I considered it for approximately 2 seconds," she said, "and then I thought, he is telling me the truth, and I let you in." "I knew the suit wasn't helping," he said. "The suit was not the point," she said. "The suit was never the point." "What was the point?" he said, though he knew. She looked at him with those green eyes that had seen through things since the first moment he had stood under their examination. "You," she said. "You were the point." He put his arm around her on the porch, and she leaned into him in the easy way of 17 years of mornings, and the sun came up over the Texas plain and lit the cottonwoods and the creek and the far line of the grazing land. And it was all exactly what he had been working toward, and more than he had known how to imagine. Thomas came home for summer in 1901, taller and more composed and full of ideas and questions and new books, and the house was full of him for those weeks in a way that felt entirely right. He and Clara spent hours in the barn arguing about horses, with the completeness of siblings who are each genuinely knowledgeable and constitutionally unable to agree. And Augusta listened to them from the kitchen with the half-smile she kept for things that were familiar and dear. Edmund and Rose, who lived in town and had 2 children of their own now, came for Sunday supper, and it was the kind of supper that fills a table with noise and food, and the comfortable overlap of people who know each other well. Edmund had become, over the years, a man of considerably more steadiness than he had arrived with, which Clarence was genuinely glad to have been some part of. After supper, when the children were in the yard and the women were talking on the porch, Edmund and Clarence sat at the kitchen table with coffee, the way men of a certain age and friendship sometimes do. "You built something good here," Edmund said. "We built something good here," Clarence said. "Augusta and I," Edmund nodded. "You chose right." "I was lucky," Clarence said, "and I was ready. Both things had to be true." Edmund looked at him with the expression of a man who understood more than he used to. "When you walked up to her door," he said, "what did you think was going to happen?" Clarence thought about it honestly. "I thought I was going to say what I felt," he said, "and accept whatever she gave back. I had stopped being able to not say it, that was all. And she let you in." "She let me in," he said. He was quiet for a moment, turning the coffee cup in his hands, and outside he could hear Augusta's voice from the porch, saying something that made Rose laugh, and from the yard he could hear Clara telling Thomas that he was entirely wrong about the bay horse's temperament. "It's a good life," Edmund said. "It's the best life," Clarence said simply. He went out to the porch a while later and stood beside Augusta, and she looked up at him from the conversation she was having, and something passed between them in that look, a recognition, not a surprise, but an acknowledgement of something known deeply and held carefully. The summer evening came down over Harlan Creek and the Bristol Ranch, with the last light going orange in the west and the first stars beginning in the east, and the horses quiet in the paddock and the cattle settled, and Thomas and Clara's voices coming from the yard, and the sound of Augusta's laugh, which Clarence had first heard from across a dusty street and had spent 17 years earning the right to hear in his own house, his own life, right beside him. He had come to her door in a borrowed suit and told her the truth, and she had let him in, and he had spent every year since then becoming the man who deserved to walk through that door. And the truth was that he had become that man with her help, because she had seen him clearly from the beginning and had not required him to be more than he was, only to be exactly what he was, fully and honestly, and that had been enough for everything. The years stretched forward from that summer evening in 1901, forward toward a future that was still being made, still being shaped by the choices of 2 people who had started with a borrowed suit and a truth told on a porch, and had built, out of those modest materials, a life so sturdy and so full that it held against anything the wide Texas plain could send against it. Thomas would return to San Antonio in September and continue his studies and eventually become a lawyer, which surprised no one who had listened to him argue about horses. Clara would grow into the kind of rancher that made her father proud and her mother quietly triumphant, taking on real management of the Bristol cattle operation in her 20s, with a competence that the men in the county would first resist and then defer to, because she was always right, and she had her mother's ability to be right without being unkind about it. Dollar's Medina would eventually buy out Augusta's remaining share of the store in 1907, when Augusta decided that teaching was her full work, and the transfer was done with warmth and mutual satisfaction, and the store continued to serve Harlan Creek for decades more under Dollar's and eventually her own family. Edmund and Rose would have 3 children altogether and remain in Harlan Creek, part of the fabric of the town, and Edmund would work the ranch alongside Clarence, until Clarence began stepping back in his late 50s, handing more to Clara and Jackson, who had by then worked the Bristol land for 20 years and was as much a part of it as the creek itself. And Clarence and Augusta would grow old on their land, in the house they had built and added to and lived in together, with the cottonwoods down by the creek taller and wider every year, and the morning porch where they stood with their coffee, still the place from which everything looked exactly right. On an evening in the autumn of 1907, 23 years after he had walked up her porch in a borrowed suit, Clarence found Augusta on the settle in their sitting room with a book in her lap and her reading glasses on, which were a concession she had made in the last year with some resistance, and he sat beside her, and she moved the book to make room and leaned against him with the ease of a thing that had always been true. "What are you reading?" he said. She showed him the cover. It was a novel, one she had ordered from the bookstore in San Antonio, a story about people in a different place and a different time navigating the same permanent human things. "Is it good?" he said. "It is very good," she said. "The woman in it does not wait for anyone to tell her who she is." "I know someone like that," he said. She looked at him sideways over her glasses with the expression she had refined over 23 years from something careful into something completely his. "You do," she said. "You have always known exactly who she was." "Yes," he said, "from the beginning." She turned a page, and he sat beside her in the lamplight, and the house was quiet, and the ranch was settled for the night, and the Texas stars were doing what Texas stars had always done, burning vast and unhurried above the wide plain, indifferent to the small human stories below, while the small human stories went on being everything. This was the life Clarence Bristol had gone to earn, wearing a borrowed suit and carrying a truth he could no longer keep inside him, on a Saturday afternoon in October of 1883. He had said, "I want to earn the real one." He had earned it. Every day since he had earned it. And Augusta Underwood Bristol, who had opened her door and looked at a man telling the truth and decided to let him in, had known, with the certainty that was the signature of her entire character, that she had made the right call. She had made the right call. They sat together in the lamplight, and the years settled around them like something solid and warm, all of it built from the most available materials: honesty, effort, love given without calculation, and the willingness to walk up to a door not knowing what waited on the other side and knock anyway, because some things are worth the risk of the answer.